of pushing it forward in a bipartisan fashion. Then after church, straight over to the inauguration. We expect Biden's remarks after he is inaugurated to be about 20 to 30 minutes. He's going to talk about key themes that we've heard him talk about before: unity, the need to heal this country, but also, if the last few days are any indication, he's going to lead with empathy, infusing parts of his personal story into a country right now that is in deep need of healing, both from the more than 400,000 Americans who have been lost to the coronavirus, but also from the divisions that we've seen only further deepened during the last few days and weeks as Trump has been the outgoing president of the United States.
Allie, you're near the White House, where not long ago we saw President Trump leave there, get on Marine One, and then we just heard from him a few moments ago before departing on Air Force One to Florida. What's been his primary message this morning?
Well, the thing he has not said yet is the name President Joe Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris. All of us were listening for that. He did wish the next administration luck, but listen to what he said over there at Joint Base Andrews for a really atypical send-off for the kind that we have not seen for an outgoing president of the United States. Listen.
This is a great honor, the honor of a lifetime, the greatest people in the world, the greatest home in the world. We built it a home. We've had an amazing 4 years. We've accomplished a lot. We love the American people. Once again, it has been something very special. And I just want to say goodbye, but hopefully it's not a long-term goodbye. We'll see each other again. Thank you all very much.
Mr. President, do you have any regrets about...
And of course, that was the president leaving the White House. That's just from a timing perspective, not something that we would see typically until after the next president is inaugurated. Trump, of course, flipping the logistics of this day on its head, going from the White House on Marine One over to where Air Force One is waiting for him at Joint Base Andrews. There we heard cannons saluting him. He thanked his family, his chief of staff. The people in the crowd there were White House allies, former aides and advisors. They were told that they could bring up to 5 guests with them. And so while the Biden crew is trying to have as few people here as possible celebrating this inauguration in person, clearly the Trump mindset on a completely opposite pole, something that we've seen throughout this transition. But again, beginning as we ended, a total split screen moment between the incoming and outgoing presidents.
Absolutely. Allie, you said it on this program earlier this morning, unprecedented, the fact that we are not seeing this outgoing president and incoming president cross paths at all on the day of the inauguration. Allie, thanks so much.
After Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are sworn in, they'll head to Arlington National Cemetery to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier.
They'll then return to Washington for their inauguration parade of sorts. But the parade will be largely virtual, as crowds are not allowed to watch this year because of the pandemic. NBC News correspondent Morgan Radford joins us now from that parade route. Morgan, good morning. All right, so give us a preview. What are we actually going to see at this parade? Of course, between the pandemic and the security that we're seeing there, there's not crowds. This isn't the normal celebratory vibe that you'd see in the streets of a parade. So tell us what we will see.
You nailed it, Savannah. We are inside a secure perimeter, but the reality of it is those celebratory events of today's procession will happen here just behind me. This is where that parade begins in person, or otherwise known as a presidential escort. And this is where both the newly minted president and vice president will be honored by their alma maters. You're going to hear from the University of Delaware Band, the Howard University Band, where they're going to play a special cadence in honor of Vice President Kamala Harris. But it's also where you're going to see representatives of every single branch of the military. And they're going to begin here and then escort them to the White House for the first time as president and vice president. And then from there, Savannah, everything goes virtual. You're going to hear from Tony Goldwyn, who will be hosting an event. You're going to hear from people like Earth, Wind and Fire, a whole host of celebrities, of events from all 50 states honoring and celebrating this new administration. But the reality of it is, Savannah, as you mentioned, this is an unprecedented inauguration. And some say the intense security is sort of putting a stain on the more celebratory elements of this. We spoke to U.S. Representative Alma Adams from North Carolina yesterday. She was there in the Capitol, hunkered down in a secure location on the day that it was attacked. And we asked her, she's planning to come here in person, one of the few people who will be here at inauguration in person. And we asked her if the security was hampering the celebratory effects for her. Take a listen to what she said.
Well, clearly, you know, all of the fencing and so forth puts us at another time. And we were, I think, comfortable with the fact that COVID and making sure that people were safe and that we were health conscious. But then to have the military reinforcements come in, I think has startled some, but we are still not going to let this dampen the celebratory moment that it is.
So security is top of mind, both for the in-person and for the virtual parade. Savannah, Joe?
Morgan Radford, thank you so much.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, President Trump delivered a final message to the American people this morning.
Let's go right to NBC News White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell joins us now. So, Kelly, let's start with that farewell speech we heard in just the last hour. The president cited some of his accomplishments, notably said, "We will be back in some form." It wasn't the 2024 campaign announcement that some had speculated, but he did leave that out there. What was the main point of his message this morning?
Well, this is a day, Joe, that really feels like it's over. And yet at the same time, President Trump hinted of a life after his White House years, and how that will take shape, we don't yet know. But he clearly made the point that he wants to remain somehow in the national conversation. And that has been one of the things the president has been adept at doing over his time in the political phase of his public life, staying in the conversation. Today, we're at Joint Base Andrews, where the crowd has just been sort of moved to the buses to leave the base. The tearing down of the staging they set up is happening. And there was one sort of final gesture as Air Force One was taxiing and taking off here at Joint Base Andrews. The soundtrack was Frank Sinatra and My Way. No accident in that. That was certainly an end note for President Trump that really described a lot of his time in office. During his remarks, he thanked family, he thanked staff, he thanked some of the Republicans in Congress, the vice president, talked about some of the accomplishments, and in a few instances, sort of urged people to remember his influence, talking about the fact that he believes he has set a good foundation for the next administration. Obviously, they view that quite differently, because over the next 10 days, we'll see Joe Biden as president doing some executive orders and other actions that come with the power of his office to undo and reverse some of the steps taken during the Trump years. But this was in some ways a sentimental Donald Trump as far as we're accustomed to seeing him in public life, not as emotional as other public figures, but you got a sense of that today as he took in the final part of his Washington life. Of course, his shadow will continue even in the next days and weeks, with the expectation of a Senate trial coming at some point, still to be determined, for his second impeachment. So he's in the air now. It is still Air Force One until about noon today, when the oath of office is given to Joe Biden. With that, he's got some of the trappings of the office, like the nuclear codes with the military aid. A duplicate set of that has been made available and is ready to step in to President Joe Biden when he takes the oath of office. And then that military aid will fly back to Washington with the nuclear codes that are deactivated. So those are some of the things that are a little different about today. We understand that President Trump did leave a note for President-elect Joe Biden. Of all of the traditions that he has discarded, he did keep with that one, which is traditional for presidents to offer some kind of a personal note to their successor. The president did not refer to Joe Biden at all, except to refer to the new administration. And at one point, Melania Trump made a few remarks talking about this being an honor for her to serve as First Lady. And when she finished up, the president said, "What's left to be said?" Well, the thing not said was any good wishes for Dr. Jill Biden or the president-elect. So they did not name their successors, but they acknowledged them. And it's sort of a wrap on the Trump administration.
Absolutely. Kelly, you mentioned that soundtrack, which, by the way, is a soundtrack you've valiantly fought against to bring us these reports for the last few years, and also notable YMCA played as he finished off his last address as the President of the United States to the American people. I want to ask you now about news from overnight. President Trump issuing a final round of pardons. One of them was pretty notable. Tell us about that.
Well, Steve Bannon, who had served as a campaign advisor, as strategist inside the White House, at times very much at the heart of the inner circle and at times on the outs, he has been charged in a scheme of collecting money from Trump supporters to try to build the wall, in a scheme that argued that the Congress was making that difficult for President Trump, so supporters would be able to donate directly to the construction of the wall. The allegation is that he skimmed some of that money for personal use. He has not yet gone to trial. He has entered a not guilty plea. But the president wiped out the federal case against him. There may, of course, be state cases that could be a part of any of these pardons or commutations, because the president's power is only about federal crimes. But that's very notable. And it stands out because Steve Bannon could be a part of the president's life in a political sense going forward. He's a populist. He is a tough player who has a voice with a lot of the Trump supporters. So there may be some personal interest in doing that. He was advised against it, we're told, by various officials. And then of the 143 pardons and commutations, there are some people who've come to him through knowing friends and associates or lawyers who brought their case. There are some former members of Congress and a finance chair for the RNC. Public corruption cases that have now been wiped out by the president's use of the pen to pardon those. And then there are others who are more traditional pardons and clemency and commutation that are not names that are well known. But that's part of the closing day of almost any presidency. And certainly President Trump has always liked using that power, and he did so today. Joe, Savannah?
O'Donnell, thank you so much as the stage comes down behind you and the presidency ends. Thanks. We'll see you soon.
But we're going to keep going. Let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos to help us break down some of President Trump's pardons. So, Danny, as we were just talking about, the big name on the list is Steve Bannon. Why him? How might this pardon help or hurt the president in any future legal battles?
Pardoning Steve Bannon is consistent with the president's recent pardons of those in his close political circle, be it Paul Manafort or Roger Stone. Although with those folks, he let them go through the entire prosecution process. In this case, Steve Bannon's getting the benefit of an earlier pardon. But it may turn around to bite the president if it removes their Fifth Amendment self-incrimination privileges. And all of those folks who may have information on the president can be called to testify.
Now, Danny, it is important to point out that Trump does still have a few hours left to add names to this list of pardons. But as of right now, he's left his own name off the list, along with his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Now, what happens if he's criminally charged down the line? Does he have any protection?
Not as a private citizen. He loses completely the power to pardon anyone, including himself. There is no ex-president pardon power. It only exists so long as he is the president. But as the great legal scholar Yogi Berra said, it is not over until it is over, and he can pardon right up until the last second. If he still had Twitter, he could do it by tweet.
All right, Danny Cevallos, thank you so much.
As an unprecedented 25,000 National Guard troops stand at the ready for inauguration, the Pentagon announced that 12 members were taken off security for the event after FBI vetting. NBC News correspondent for investigations, Tom Winter, joins us now. So, Tom, what do we know about why these service members were flagged? What did they do that caused that to be the case?
Well, Savannah, good morning. Anytime you have an event of this size, of this magnitude, and after what we saw happen at the Capitol just 2 weeks ago, you want to approach this with every precaution in mind. You want to make every decision from a standpoint of, can we just alleviate a potential problem? Can we just get rid of a potential concern and err on the side of caution? That's what the Pentagon says they did yesterday. Let's take a listen.
We're not asking questions right now. We're not asking questions of people who are flagged. We're, out of an abundance of caution, taking action and immediately removing them from the line of duty at the Capitol and the events taking place. And then we will address them, whether it's through law enforcement if necessary or through their own chain of command.
So basically, Savannah and Joe, what we had happen here was they took a look at statements that people made either on social media or statements that were overheard by their fellow National Guard members. And they said, you know what, these people don't need to be a part of this, and they're moving on, and they're trying to make sure that this is a secure event.
Now, Tom, the FBI did this vetting because of the inauguration, but what level of vetting is normally done for service members?
Well, normally this is and this still is a national special security event. It gets a special designation every 4 years that this happens, and the Secret Service runs the security. So usually they do, in fact, go over a list of everybody that's been credentialed that's close to this stage, what we're looking at right now. That includes journalists, it includes dignitaries, it includes friends and family of whoever's been elected. So that's the normal vetting process. But I think this year, given what we saw happen 2 weeks ago, given the fact that former members of the military were involved in that, law enforcement included, they wanted to take an extra look this week. And again, it just goes back to alleviating any potential concerns.
Tom, thanks so much.
Sure thing.
Now, once he becomes president, Joe Biden will inherit a challenging global environment, some of which has lost some confidence in the U.S. over recent years.
NBC News senior international correspondent Keir Simmons is in London with a look at what's ahead for Biden on the global stage. Good morning, Keir.
Hey, Joe, good morning to you. And we're outside 10 Downing Street, home to British Prime Ministers for 275 years, where they will be watching history made across the pond. The President of Europe saying today, after 4 long years, Europe has a friend in the White House.
President-elect Biden will inherit a world where America's reputation is badly bruised. From Moscow,
it's very terrible situation in the United States,
to the Middle East.
More peace and less confrontations. This will be good.
To Munich.
You can't just act like nothing happened just because someone else has been elected, but I think it's going to change for the better.
A new poll says even before the Capitol riots, 1 in 3 Europeans thought Americans can't be trusted. America's new president has a mountain to climb.
We have to fight COVID, administer a vaccine program, rebuild our alliance structure, and try to combat the rise of China and the influence of Russia.
President Putin was famously close to President Trump, but the Biden administration has promised action on a massive suspected Russian hack of federal agencies.
And I promise you, there'll be a response.
This, along with a deadline for a US-Russia arms deal in just 4 weeks. Tensions with China are sky high too, with its expanding military and President Trump's trade war.
For the past 4 years, someone in the United States has poisoned China-US relations, and China-US relations today are the worst ever.
While Biden has had strong words for President Xi.
This is a guy who doesn't have a Democratic with a small d bone in his body. This is a guy who is a thug.
But many U.S. allies have been doing deals with China while feeling sidelined by the U.S.
I think everybody is excited.
Now looking for a renewed focus on U.S. alliances.
You can do things collectively, together in a spirit of cooperation.
He'll need those alliances to tackle Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and his promise to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord on day one. Around the world, many people are hoping President Biden will change their lives.
At the very least, I'd like to see some support to Arabs.
Questioning whether American leadership in the world has changed for good.
And a new Pew poll this morning shows there is huge support here in Europe for President-elect Biden. In Germany, 79%, in France, 72%, here in the UK, 65%. The challenge for President-elect Biden is not the support for him, it's to change concerns about America. The polls also suggest that people are worried and think even that China could be the most powerful country within 10 years, guys.
Here, thank you so much.
We're just hours away from the inauguration of Joseph R. Biden.
Continuing coverage of this historic event next after the break.
Everybody, welcome to Today. It is good to have you with us.
As we start a new year, we're right there with you to kick it off right.
Let's go 2021.
Stay healthy.
We're going to show you all the ways to keep calm and de-stress.
And stay connected every morning on Today.
I'll tell you what the American people's mandate is. Heal the nation. It's why you ran. That
is why he won.
How close to the breaking point is our hospital system? Why should we feel confident that vaccine distribution will
moves forward with his transition? What are your priorities going to be on those first days? With vaccinations ramping up.
How are you feeling? Incredibly optimistic that we're at this point.
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Trucks carrying the first U.S. shipment of the coronavirus vaccine. Hope for a whole lot of people who have been waiting months and months.
It's news made for your streaming world.
Are you ready?
Yes. Monday boost?
Are you ready for a boost?
How do you feel about that book? We love those nurses. That was beautiful.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
I didn't know, was my child dead? Is my child passed out?
I just kept saying, please be okay, please be okay.
You rush your child to the hospital.
A woman came in, normal clothes. We get down the hallway, and she closes the door. They were accusing me of child abuse.
And that's when the real nightmare begins.
Hey, calm down.
No, it's my children. I can't calm down.
Do No Harm. All 6 episodes, plus a special bonus episode, are available now. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
We have been living in perpetual grief. The incomprehensible loss of life, shuttered businesses, the fabric of civility ripped apart. We found solace in our heroes. And now finally, we see what hope looks like. Our worst year is over. Thanks to science, defeating the virus appears to be in reach. How we heal the wounds left behind will define how history remembers not just the virus, but us.
Welcome back. Inaugural activities are now officially underway.
President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris are currently attending Catholic Mass. They are at Cathedral of St. Matthew of the Apostle, attending Mass. Here you see the doors of the church before going to the Capitol for their swearing in. Let's go back to our political correspondents, Vaughn Hilliard and Ali Vitale. Vaughn, I want to start with you. Normally on a day like today, I'd say you're among the people. This year's a little different. We know the area in and around the Capitol is shut down. What's it like where you are?
Usually there's thousands too many people to talk to, and usually if you try to talk to one person, there's like 20 other people over your shoulder yelling into the camera. But that is the furthest thing from being the case because it is 2021, the 10th inning of 2020. We just saw in the last hour, Marine One, you guys watched that footage live. You saw Marine One, we're looking down E Street right here, take off from the White House, swing around. Peter, our photog, is gonna kind of show you where we are. That is Trump Hotel, just on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue over there. You saw Marine One pass by. Essentially, not only was Donald Trump having his farewell of Washington, D.C., but there were people on the ground as well. I want to introduce you to Ann and Al, who came here from New York City. This was their first inauguration. It's a heck of a one. Listen to why they came down.
Hope is the biggest draw here to kind of just celebrate hopefully our country moving forward and this really to overcome these last horrible 4 years.
And there's not many folks, but Al and Ann said they're going to be here until Joe Biden is sworn in to ensure he is, in fact, this next president. But you have the likes of some pups, some bicyclers. There's another dog down the road. There's as many dogs as there are humans here at this inauguration, at least for the general public out here with us. Joe and Savannah.
Love the dog photo shoot taking place there, Vaughn. And it's nice to see you with Al and Ann. So you were among some people, though not what we are used to.
And canines.
Yeah.
Correct. More friends are coming out to play as the sun comes up.
Yeah, look at that. 2 dogs behind you. All right, Ali, let's bring you in now. We've talked a lot about the TikTok leading up to Joe Biden being sworn in as our next president. But now let's talk about once he is president. He's planning to sign a series of executive actions today. Tell us what he plans.
Yeah, Savannah, this is really the point where the campaign promises meet the policy perspective here in Washington, D.C. Joe Biden, over the course of this very long campaign, made a lot of promises about what he would do on day one. Day one in this case is actually now more like days 1 through 10, because they are splitting up all of these executive orders into different days so that each of them can really have their moment in the sun. And a lot of them are reversing things that the Trump administration did right off the bat. So reversing the Muslim ban, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. But there's also a pretty controversial immigration bill that they are sending over to Capitol Hill at some point today. Part of it includes a pathway to citizenship. It's going to be interesting to see the way that that manifests on the Hill, especially because Joe Biden, as we've talked about, has said he can build bipartisanship. But this is an issue that really vexed Obama administration officials and Capitol Hill during the Obama era. It's something that Biden said he promised to do on day one, so he is literally doing it, sending that bill over. But a lot of these things, including protections for DACA recipients, for Dreamers, a lot of those things can only come through legislation on Capitol Hill. So today really is a divide between the things that Biden can do on his own and the things that Biden has to do along with congressional leaders. I would say the thing that's really striking here is covering the Trump administration, there was policy coming from the agencies, but rarely was Trump out there touting the policy achievements of his administration. It's clear now, and I was just talking to a former Obama administration official about this, that this group is going to lead with policy front and center. They've got a lot of crises on the horizon right now that need dealing with as soon as possible, from coronavirus to the economic recession. They're fixing those with policy.
Allie and Vaughn, thank you both so much for your reporting this morning. Today's inauguration parade will be mostly virtual, as we've mentioned, due to the pandemic and security concerns. Biden and Harris will still march with their families, but you won't see any waving fans on the streets.
NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster joins us now from the parade's starting point at 15th Street in Washington. Now, Shaq, as we just said, there won't be too much of an actual parade there, starting where you are. It's this parade across America with performances from across the country, as Joe mentioned, since it's mostly virtual. But tell us what we will see today.
That's right, Savannah. You'll actually see more of the parade programming than I will see here on the ground. And that's because, as you mentioned, much of it is going to be virtual. We're right here at the starting point of the parade route. So we'll see then President Joe Biden and then Vice President Kamala Harris make their way up 15th Street and be joined back there with bands. So we will see some programming here on the ground, but we will not see what we normally see. And, you know, the lieutenant colonel who's in charge of this entire parade and programming was on the Today Show this morning and explained that it's going to look much different than anything that we have seen in the past. Of course, yes, there are the security concerns that we've been talking about, but there's also the pandemic consideration. So instead of having the 12,000 people that former President Obama had in 2009, or even the 8,000 people parade participants that President Trump had in 2017, there's just a few hundred people when you add the bands and the procession that will take place on 15th Street and then up until Pennsylvania Avenue. Savannah?
Shaq, the parade had to be reimagined in a lot of ways. What went into planning and executing all of this?
Well, we talked about some of the security concerns. I mean, the parade is something that is normally a heavily fortified event anyways. If you look at old video from parades, you see lines of police officers before you even get to the crowds. And of course, the president and the vice president then make their way up the parade route. This will be a much shorter parade. So normally it's a parade that stretches along Pennsylvania Avenue. This one will just be about 3 city blocks. In terms of the planning, because of that virtual element, we'll expect to see different pre-recorded programming, different elements of pre-recorded programming from all 50 states and 6 territories. So all of that, of course, takes a lot of planning. I think if you want to look for a comparison, think back to what we saw during the Democratic National Convention, where you saw each state have somewhat of a moment there in their respective states. That's what it's going to look like once, of course, the president and the vice president make their way down the processional.
Shaq, I know it's hard to compare today's events to the past because, I mean, everything about this year is just so different. But in terms of
everything's different.
I mean, truly, nothing is the same. In terms of other inaugural parades, though, that stand out historically, how's this one compare?
Well, what we will see, and what is the same, is that walk from, or that escort, the military escort for the president and vice president to the White House. So we will see them, at some point we do expect them to walk, but we will see them walk onto the White House grounds. And that's something that has happened and this was something that the Lieutenant Colonel mentioned this morning, has happened for the past 250 years. So you will see that element. That is something that will be the same. But of course, you will not see that long procession. This was a parade that at one point had floats. At one point had big arches as the president and vice president make their way down Pennsylvania Avenue. It's something that has had a lot of pomp and circumstance, and you will not see that this time around. Again, just 3 weeks, or just 3 blocks as the president and vice president make their way to the White House.
Jax, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Now, with just hours to go until the inauguration of Joe Biden, President Trump already departed the White House for the last time in a send-off at Joint Base Andrews. NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba joins us now from West Palm Beach, Florida, where the president is currently heading aboard Air Force One. Now, Monica, it's, of course, not typical, as we just said with Shaq. Nothing is the same right now for the sitting president to leave Washington before their successor is sworn in. So what do you know about how this event came together and the speech that President Trump gave there?
You're absolutely right, Savannah. It is really rare for an outgoing president, especially one like Donald Trump, who could have attended Joe Biden's inauguration. He just simply chose not to skip the entirety of the event. So we know that this ceremonial send-off that took place earlier at Andrews was something the president wanted. He wanted to thank some supporters and former aides and officials who had gathered there. But I was particularly struck by who wasn't there. Vice President Mike Pence, for instance, was not in attendance because he is going to be going to the inauguration. But something that we've just learned, and NBC News was first to report, Savannah, is the fact that though the president has busted a lot of norms, one he did continue as a tradition was, we're told he did leave a note for President-elect Biden in the Oval Office. Unclear what the contents of that letter will be, but that is a tradition going back several presidents. So we will be continuing to report out the details of that, which will be a big storyline for today, Savannah and Joe.
Absolutely.
Monica, once President Trump does land in Florida, what's the plan? Do we know what he's going to do?
The timing is actually pretty notable, Joe, because he's in the air now. He may land in the 11 a.m. hour. Of course, his presidency ends at noon, so he will be deplaning with the First Lady and some other family members. They're going to get into their last presidential motorcade and head to Mar-a-Lago, their private club here in South Florida. And then we expect him to be completely out of view, at least not in front of any public or television cameras at the moment the oath of office is given to President-elect Joe Biden. A note that is just so interesting to people and nerds like me and you is that the nuclear football has to travel with President Trump down here to Florida. But then, of course, there's a second nuclear football that gets activated for those codes once Joe Biden takes the oath of office at noon, guys.
Monica, thank you so much.
Since the Capitol riot, people in the conspiracy theory community QAnon are becoming increasingly fractured.
These supporters are now sharing inaccurate information about Inauguration Day through lesser-known messaging apps. NBC News found many accounts even believe today is the cult's long-awaited doomsday. NBC News tech reporter Ben Collins joins us now with more on his reporting. So, Ben, I think one of the things we got to start with right there is just what does that mean, this doomsday? And I know that you report QAnon followers falsely expect President Trump to remain the country's leader even after the inauguration. Why are followers holding on to that inaccurate information?
Yeah, well, they're holding on because they have nothing else left. You know, QAnon is a doomsday cult where the very end of it is the roundup and mass execution in public of Democrats. And they believe that today is this elaborate setup. Donald Trump will remain president at the end of it, and the inauguration is a way to round up all the Democrats. I know that sounds nuts, but they actually fully believe this, and they think that noon is going to be their judgment day. They think it's going to be a true doomsday. So right now, they are all working each other into a lather right now on the internet, on their own spaces. They are very excited about today, and they're going to be very disappointed at noon today.
And Ben, some of the messaging about today is pretty violent. I mean, are extremist experts concerned at all about this?
Yeah, they are concerned. I mean, especially after the 6th, a lot of those people in the Capitol were QAnon supporters. They were wearing Q merchandise. They were notable Q people from rallies, from Trump rallies previously in the past. I don't think a lot of people thought they were capable of this, in part because, QAnon is sort of a passive movement. It relies on the government taking over and the government doing all these executions. But recently, it appears as if they think they need to take it into their own hands. And they've been, sort of partnering with militias and people who have a lot of experience in prepping for actual doomsdays, for actual days where they're trying to commit insurrection. That's what gets people worried, is that Q people have started to meld with militias in the last few weeks since Parler shut down.
Now, Ben, I mentioned a minute ago that they've turned to some of these lesser known apps, and I know that's where you've been finding some of these messages in your reporting. So let's talk about how we got here. Why did this community turn to smaller, unmoderated messaging apps?
So, the big thing is Parler shut down. Parler is that conservative network that was hosting a lot of these violent messages, but they had a little bit of moderation, and there were regular people on there, too. There were regular conservatives on there that sort of steered the ship towards non-militant talk most of the time. Now, since then, they have tried to replicate that feed they had, but they've only found extremists on places like Telegram. Telegram used to be used by terror groups like ISIS. Now it's used by militias, and militias are explicitly recruiting these people who feel adrift after the shutdowns of these services.
All right, Ben, thank you so much. We'll let you get back to keeping an eye on what everyone's saying today. Appreciate your reporting.
Great reporting. New polling from NBC News points to an America that's deeply polarized and pessimistic about its own future as Joe Biden prepares to take his oath of office.
And the data show a whopping 73% of registered voters say that America is headed down the wrong path. NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray joins us now. So, Mark, that is a daunting number, especially at the very beginning of a new presidency. So how are these voters feeling about Joe Biden? Are they hopeful or are they hopeless?
Yeah, and you have to look at the context of what's occurred in the last 2 months since the election. And of course, it was President Trump contesting the election, trying to overturn the results. The riot, of course, that happened on January 6th, a second impeachment for the president. And normally when you end up getting to this inaugural stage, today's inauguration, it is kind of a rebirth where you put aside the politics of the campaign, but we are still kind of in campaign mode, according to our poll. And Joe, what is interesting, that 73% of voters who think that the country is on the wrong track, not only is that shared by majorities of Democrats, independents, and Republicans, but it's also 13 percentage points higher than it was in our poll right before the election. And it's at the highest mark it's been in the last 4.5 years. And so this is a very big challenge for Joe Biden, and something I'm sure he's going to be addressing in his inaugural address this afternoon.
And now, Mark, we know another large group of voters say the country will remain divided over the next 4 years, with a vast majority of Republicans subscribing to that belief. Tell us about that stat that we've got there and what's contributing to that feeling.
Yeah. And again, I think it's a lot of the same context. And of course, punctuated obviously by the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. But, Joe Biden ended up really selling himself as a uniter during his presidential bid in the primaries and in the general election. It was often met with some snickering by Democratic folks who were supporting maybe a different side. But that unity is going to be put to the test. And, Joe Biden was asked in the last presidential debate by our own Kristen Welker what he would end up saying in his inaugural address to people who didn't vote for him. And Joe Biden's answer was, I'm going to be your president, even if you didn't vote for me. And so I do think that this is one of the reasons to tee up incoming President Joe Biden's inaugural address today, because it allows him to start addressing that unity, which a lot of people don't think is coming.
Absolutely. And these numbers you've shared with us, Mark, lay out just how much work there is to do to get this country, back together, more unity. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chicago is with us, along with presidential historian Alan Lichtman and NBC News national security contributor Chris Watts, all joining us now. Thank you for being with us. Chris, I want to start with the various crises that soon-to-be President Biden is set to inherit right away. He's announced plans to sign more than a dozen executive actions right after he arrives at the White House. What will be his initial focus and his priority?
Yeah, we have a long list of priorities that Joe Biden has. First among them is clearly the COVID pandemic. I think that they're looking at that, particularly within the first 100 days and the 100 million shots in arms, as really the benchmark by which they will be judged. And so I think that's going to be a top priority for them. There are also a number of others that you talked about, including keeping the freeze on student loan debt, looking at rejoining the Paris Accords, this immigration bill that he's doing, which is really going to be a test of how bipartisan this new administration is going to be and how much Republicans are going to reach across the aisle and work with them. You also have a number of other crises. You have kind of a day of jubilation, which we're looking at, a real sense of relief among Democrats out there, but also kind of this trepidation among the Biden folks because they don't necessarily know what they're walking into in this White House. The transition with the Trump administration was not smooth. There were a number of hiccups, a number of agencies that didn't work really with the Biden transition in a way that the transition wanted. And so, when they start opening the files, when they start cracking the books, I think this crisis that they're walking into with COVID, with the economy, it could be even deeper when they start really looking into what things look like in the White House.
Alan, I want to bring you in here for some historical context. There's 10,000 questions we could ask you to sort of lay out here just exactly how starkly different this is than any other inauguration. Let's just start with the fact that President Trump did not mention Biden's name in his farewell address. We know, of course, he's not attending the inauguration ceremonies. He's already left the District of Columbia. We did hear that he left a note for incoming President Biden, though we don't know the context of that note. We don't know anything in it quite yet. How does this all reflect upon the strength of our country's lasting institution of a peaceful transfer of power, to not see these two figures cross paths at all today?
Well, Trump has done everything in his power, really throughout his presidency, to subvert fundamental institutions of our democracy. And he did it again during this terribly marred transition. But we've seen difficult transitions before. One of the most difficult was after the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, when you had a much longer transition until March 4th. There was a very frosty relationship between Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover. But the Roosevelt model offers us some hope. After all, he came into office in 1933 at the bottom of the Great Depression, with a nation in distress and despair. And how did he bring us together, not everyone, and really unify the nation and give us hope by delivering concrete, real benefits to the American people? And that's the model that Biden has got to follow. If he improves the lives of ordinary Americans, if he deals effectively with the pandemic, with the economic crisis, with the transition to a clean, renewable economy, then all of this will be forgotten. You know, Abraham Lincoln said, here's why I ignore all of my critics, because if in the end it works out well, none of this will have mattered one bit. And if it doesn't, it won't matter either.
Clinton, very, very quickly here, we're tight on time. Just when it comes to the risk of domestic extremism, what's the biggest worry right now for Joe Biden?
I think for today, things look better than they did 2 weeks ago, meaning there's been a massive response, a lot of defenses. But this won't solve the problem. These extremists have already cropped up, and many of them are even more emboldened and motivated based on January 6th. I think the one thing to think about is going into the summer of 2021 is it's going to look a lot like the 1990s. Remember Timothy McVeigh, Eric Rudolph, these sorts of things. And the thing that's been holding them back is targets. Because of the pandemic, there's not mass gatherings often, so this has limited their options. I worry that as the pandemic ends and extremists continue, we could see more mass casualty sorts of attacks in the summer of 2021.
Clint, Chris, Alan, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. So important this morning.
Thank you.
We do want to get a check on your Inauguration Day weather.
Which, of course, means...
Guys, you can see the flags in the background, some of our reporters, the hair blowing. They should double in intensity between now and over the next 2 to 3 hours. So they're really going to be kicking up. The rain and snow is gone from the area. You probably saw when you were watching Air Force One. Winds are picking up, though. Right now, they're steady at 10. We've had gusts up to 20. We expect that to almost double by the time we get to noon today. Temperatures will remain kind of steady, but those winds could gust up to 40 miles. Even the swearing-in ceremony, It'll be noticeably gusty. And we've had some crazy weather. The warmest ever was 55 degrees for Reagan's first inauguration. The coldest was his second inauguration. And it was so cold that they actually had to do the swearing-in ceremony indoors. The temperature was 7 degrees. And we've had some rainy days, too. Of course, the rainiest of them all was Franklin Delano Roosevelt with 1.7 inches of rain. And, this is January. D.C. can get some snowstorms. And that was the worst, was almost 10 inches of snow back in 1909. There's some other big things going on today, too, guys. We officially become part of the Paris climate deal. So that's a big deal also.
It certainly is. Bill, thank you so much. Still got so much to come this morning as we await the inauguration of Joe Biden.
Continuing coverage of today's procession next.
Play War Thunder now. Join millions of players across the globe in massive battles on tanks, aircraft, and helicopters in the most extensive vehicle combat game ever made. Take control over the battlefield in ground vehicles. Rain down rocket volleys and helicopters.
How close to the breaking point is our hospital system? Why should we feel confident that vaccine distribution will...
President-elect Biden moves forward with his transition. What are your priorities going to be in those first days? With vaccinations ramping up.
How are you feeling? Incredibly optimistic that we're at this point.
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Trucks carrying the first U.S. shipment of the coronavirus vaccine. Hope for a whole lot of people who have been waiting months and months.
It's news made for your streaming world.
Are you ready?
Monday boost?
Are you ready for a boost?
How do you feel about that book?
We love those nurses. That was beautiful.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
I didn't know, was my child dead? Is my child passed out?
I just kept saying, please be okay, please be okay.
You rush your child to the hospital.
A woman came in, normal clothes. We get down the hallway, and she closes the door. They were accusing me of child abuse.
And that's when the real nightmare begins.
Hey, calm down.
No, it's my children. I can't calm down.
Do No Harm. All 6 episodes, plus a special bonus episode, are available now. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
We have been living in perpetual grief. The incomprehensible loss of life, shuttered businesses, the fabric of civility ripped apart. We found solace in our heroes. And now finally, we see what hope looks like. Our worst year is over. Thanks to science, defeating the virus appears to be in reach. How we heal the wounds left behind will define how history remembers not just the virus, but us.
We're only 20 days into 2021, and we've already witnessed an insurrection, an impeachment, now an inauguration, a tradition we need perhaps now more than ever. To inaugurate means to commence, to initiate, to make a formal beginning. It is, in essence, a fresh start when a new hand is raised, when new visions come into focus.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Starting today, we must pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and begin again the work of remaking America.
Yet, in so many ways, an inauguration is also a continuation, with each president uttering the same oath dictated by the Constitution, each sworn in on the same day, January 20th, as prescribed by the 20th Amendment when it was ratified in 1933. We are reminded by the presence of presidents past that this day, this ceremony, is perhaps less of a new beginning and more of an extension. Like the torch passed before each Olympics, our presidents are runners in a relay, protecting and relinquishing the lantern of democracy, making sure their successor, whether political friend or foe, inherits a vibrant beacon. This year's inauguration will mark a stunning departure from such ritual. the absence of the outgoing president. Rather than pass the torch, critics say he used it to set the Capitol grounds ablaze, inciting an insurrection just 2 weeks ago in the very place the inauguration will happen. Now, with the smoke still smoldering, President-elect Joe Biden will take the oath, deliver his address, and try to heal an unsteady nation still feeling the aftershocks of an immeasurable political earthquake. Like so many inaugural addresses before, unity will be the priority.
May we know unity without conformity.
We as a society must rise up united.
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
Our unity, our union, is the serious work of leaders and citizens in every generation.
For all the novelty, all the change that comes with a new leader, we are reminded each inauguration is really more like a bridge, connecting presidents and leading us forward, torch in hand, democracy's flame still burning. We'll watch that torch burn in just a couple hours this morning.
Joe, a beautiful piece. Had an incredible essay there.
Our inauguration coverage continues.
Let's turn now to an NBC News special report.
The inauguration of Joseph R. Biden Jr. Here's Lester Holt and Savannah Guthrie.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our live coverage of the inauguration of Joseph R. Biden Jr. as the 46th President of the United States. The President-elect right now, at this moment, attending a service at Washington St. Matthew's Cathedral, accompanied by a bipartisan delegation of congressional leaders. But in less than 2 hours, he will take the oath of office at the Capitol, and Kamala Harris will be sworn in as Vice President. Truly a historic day.
Yeah, and we just saw the Capitol all dressed up and ready to go. It's historic because the current president, Donald Trump, chose not to be here. He left town this morning after a ceremony at Joint Base Andrews. He's now flying home aboard Air Force One to Florida. He's the first president not to attend his successor's inauguration since the Civil War. There's a lot of reasons there will be history today. That's one of them.
Yeah, and he did wish the new administration the best and said he would pray for them. There is so much that's different about today's ritual of democracy. No crowd of thousands on the mall because of the pandemic, which has now claimed more than 400,000 American lives and counting. Extremely tight security throughout Washington because of the assault on the Capitol, of course, 2 weeks ago today by a mob of Trump supporters intent on stopping the electoral vote count. That riot led to the impeachment of Donald Trump just 1 week later. His Senate trial is still pending.
But today is to look forward. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have their day ahead of them, pomp, ceremony, and also a day of great ambition. They say they intend to hit the ground running, eager to put their agenda in place. And obviously some of that will have to do with taking part some of the Trump legacy as well. We want to give you an overview of what the events of the day will look like. As mentioned, the president-elect Joe Biden just finishing up that church service in Washington, D.C.
In just a few moments, the events move just 2 miles to the southeast to the U.S. Capitol. The swearing-in ceremony will get underway at 11:15 Eastern Time on what's known as the west front of the U.S. Capitol, with Lady Gaga singing the national anthem and performances by Jennifer Lopez and Garth Brooks. And at 12 noon, Joe Biden will officially become the 46th president, taking the oath of office and delivering his inaugural address in the very spot where those rioters stormed the Capitol exactly 2 weeks ago. The contrast couldn't be any more striking.
Yeah, and then this afternoon, just after 2 o'clock, President Biden, Vice President Harris, and their spouses will be joined by former first couples Obama, Bush, and Clinton for a wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Then comes the inaugural parade, which, of course, will be different this year. It will mostly be virtual, a nod to, of course, the pandemic and also security concerns. We will see the new president and vice president being escorted to the White House, but we will not see those usual crowds.
And capping off the day, in place of the usual inaugural balls, tonight a primetime star-studded televised special hosted by Tom Hanks that will get underway at 8:30 Eastern Time.
So we've got a lot to get to today. Let's get started. Our team is in place. Let's start with NBC's political director, Meet the Press moderator Chuck Todd, also Chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Not first inauguration for either of them. Chuck, I'll start with you. We saw the president's send-off. What did you make of it?
Well, look, I mean, as we wrote this morning in First Read, 2 months ago, right after we declared Joe Biden the winner, I think you would have said, boy, Donald Trump was a failed one-term president, but a successful leader of a political movement that is here to stay. 2 months later, he imploded in his inability to accept the loss. And here he is sort of in a somewhat having to leave Washington in a bit of a humiliating manner, nobody really wanting to send him off. And he sort of slinks away. And I would argue that might be the biggest favor he's done for the country and for Joe Biden today. You know, we're going to talk a lot about him not being here. I think that is a good thing. It allows Joe Biden, it allows him to start to turn the page. The country clearly wanted to turn the page. I think this town, after what happened 2 weeks ago, desperately wants to see sort of a new tone. And so, look, this is a moment Joe Biden obviously has been thinking about for nearly 50 years. But this really is, I think, a challenge like no incoming president has had. You know, we talk about Barack Obama had a challenge, certainly George W. Bush and the way he won had a challenge. But really, we're looking at FDR, Abraham Lincoln level of challenges facing Joe Biden, the most experienced person that we've ever had elected president of the United States.
All right, Chuck, thanks very much. Let's bring in Andrea Mitchell right now. Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Well, the contrast also with the outgoing President Trump having to send these invitations, please bring 5 friends with you to Joint Base Andrews, to try to create this rally for himself with the music playing, blaring music that was more similar to a political rally, and then saying farewell, you know, thank you, have a good life, we'll see you soon. It was awkward and tentative on their last flight on Air Force One, and that was carefully timed because he wants to arrive in Florida while he can still call it Air Force One, which at 11:59, as of 11:59, he will interview on MSNBC with Joy Reid. Speaker Pelosi was asked about the noon transition of power, and she said, not noon, 11:59. She has that constitutional moment emblazoned in her mind, and it was very clear. Seeing a Senate trial with Chuck Schumer now in the majority, but very importantly today, the bipartisan prayer, the Mass at St. Matthew's, the invitation of the incoming president to have both Schumer and Mitch McConnell there. That tells you so much, as well as Mitch McConnell's comments yesterday, not by any means absolving President Trump. And there is the possibility that he's leaving himself open to conviction. The other thing about Donald Trump's departure was a passing thank you to Mike Pence. The awkwardness, the divide between the two was so pronounced after the president did not call his vice president, when Vice President Pence, his wife Karen, and the rest of their family, their children, were in lockdown and were in dire danger, as we know from subsequent videos of that horrible insurrection of people hunting him down.
And we are watching, Andrea, as you've been speaking, these images on the east front of the Capitol where we're starting to see some of those who are invited today arrive and take their places. Usually there would be tens of thousands here, but in this case, only about 1,000 invited guests, a nod to both security and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We also have former presidents already in the vicinity. I mentioned earlier, President Bush and Laura Bush are there. The Obamas just arrived moments ago. The Clintons have been seen on the east front of the Capitol, and so we're starting to see now. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. He's in Lafayette Park, which is just outside the White House, of course. Peter, good morning.
Savannah, good morning to you. You note that the Obamas have now arrived at the Capitol, and perhaps it's only fitting that former President Barack Obama was the first to formally congratulate President Joe Biden on Twitter just moments ago, saying, "Congratulations to my friend, President Joe Biden. This is your time." Those two men, aides, have described to me that relationship formed during their time in office. They said initially, aides did, that it was sort of a relationship of convenience, but they grew so close together, and it will be the Obamas among the other past presidents who helped celebrate this crucial moment in American history as Joe Biden is sworn in as the country's 46th president. In much the same way that Donald Trump was this sort of great disruptor, this insurgent candidate that came to Washington to change Washington, Joe Biden is in many ways a president who knows Washington better than any before him. Serving almost 50 years here, will lead this country, his aides suggest, through this awful pandemic, pandemic, of course, and the challenges that it has brought to the economy as well. This morning, it was by design that Biden went to that church service surrounded by the bipartisan congressional leaders. By design that his first act here in Washington during his arrival yesterday was that national moment of mourning and remembrance, the lighting of 400 columns of light to remember the lives of 400,000 Americans lost, a sort of collective catharsis. So while today will be about pomp and pageantry, it will also be about policy. His inaugural address, aides say, focused not on Donald Trump, not on Joe Biden, but on the people of America, the people who Joe Biden has said need healing during this very difficult time. Savannah and Hoda and Lester.
Of the president-elect and Dr. Biden at that church service, the Mass. Jay Johnson was Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama and joins us. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. You know, I note that the pictures we're seeing right now, we're not seeing that ring of steel and armed troops, but they're there. They won't be a part of the large image we're watching today. But going forward, how does that end? Because nothing that we were going to see today is necessarily going to stop these extremist feelings that overflowed 2 weeks ago.
Lester, that's a good question. For a long time, the U.S. Capitol has been considered the people's house. We resisted the notion of a fence, a barrier around it, like we have at the White House or the Pentagon or other federal buildings or military installations. And in my lifetime, and I have a picture when I was about 8 years old, of my family and I parking our car in public parking just steps away from that eastern front of the Capitol that you just showed there in the images. All that's changed now. And every time we enhance security, whether it's at a federal building or an airport by way of screening, we're reluctant to go back. We're reluctant to take it off. I'd like to believe that all of the security we see right now around the Capitol is just a temporary state. It really should be the people's house. You know, as I'm sure you know, there's a visitor center now with a lot of security. But there is something to be said for access by the American people to their representatives in Congress at the U.S. Capitol. And so I'm really hoping this is temporary. It is very, very different from the inauguration of 4 years ago, where I had the responsibility for the overall security of the event. It's because of the situation we're in right now.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
You bring up a good point, Secretary Johnson, and you're in a unique vantage point here that you actually did oversee the security 4 years ago. And when you compare what was done then to what is happening now, I mean, it's just a huge ramp up by necessity.
This, we like to say peaceful transfer of power. It's a cliche. This was not a peaceful transfer of power as a result of the events of January 6th. And none of us should ever take that for granted again. You know, we have a resilient democracy, but it depends very much upon the maturity and the responsibility of those who lead our government, who exercise power in Washington. And we now know what the dangers are of a threat to our democracy if those with a microphone, those with power, incite violence, encourage people to come to Washington and do what they did 2 weeks ago.
There was a time we could be closer to our presidents. This was not only a threat against the Capitol, this was ultimately a threat against democracy. And you have to ask about Joe Biden. Okay. Will he be behind an even thicker wall of security? Will that separate him more from the American people?
Well, the Secret Service, which protects the president, is, in my judgment, the best protection agency in the world. When I was at DHS, I oversaw the Secret Service. They're part of DHS. I was also a protectee myself of the Secret Service for 3 years. And I know from personal experience that the Secret Service knows how to do this. while also granting their protectee, particularly the president, access to the American people. They will adjust and they will do an extraordinary job.
Secretary Jay Johnson, always good to have you on. Thank you for coming on with us today.
And we've been watching, as we've been having this conversation, some of the arrivals, some of the congressional leaders, saw Senator Klobuchar, saw Senator Schumer, some of the House leaders arriving, and we are starting to see a motorcade. So the things are starting to happen there on the west front of the Capitol where the inauguration will take place. And we turn now in our coverage to Mike Barnicle, a veteran journalist and NBC News contributor, and also a longtime friend of the Bidens. And I think it's fair to call you, Mike, something of a Biden whisperer. I wonder if you've been in touch and if you could share what you feel his mindset is as he takes this office and takes on challenges that perhaps no one could have imagined even a year ago.
Yeah, that's for sure, Savannah. I think one word would describe where his mind is right now: determined. I think he's determined to just change the country, to calm the country down. And I think a lot of it is encapsulated in something he said last night at the Reflecting Pool that might stand out and have more resonance than anything he says in the upcoming inaugural address. When he said last night, to heal is to remember. And as all the pictures have shown us, and as you and Lester have been talking about, I mean, the inauguration is taking place today in a city that's virtually empty. There are no huge crowds. There are no huge numbers on the stand behind the president-elect as he takes the oath of office. But I think he urges us to remember so much that we seem to have forgotten in the most recent past, namely the 400,000 plus victims of the virus who have died in anonymity and loneliness, many of them. To remember what this country is all about, to remember what this country can do when it's determined to do it, to remember that government works efficiently for people and helps lift up people when government is used properly. So I think that's on his mind going forward. And I think the biggest distinction between today and the past literally 48 months, we can now look to the Oval Office and look to the President of the United States, Joseph R. Biden, and say with certainty, he is a good man.
Mike, he will make pledges today during his speech and goals. But when it comes to this idea of unity, what's the measure of success?
Boy, that's a good question, Lester. I mean, the measure of success, I think, immediately will be things like, you know, do you get the massive appropriation bill through Congress? You know, the update of the CARES Act. Do you get another $1 trillion or $2 trillion to help people who are desperate for help? I mean, people who have been thrown out of their homes, lost their homes, been evicted from their apartments, to get the logistics down properly for the distribution of the vaccine. Can that be done successfully? Can he begin to deal with the infrastructure problems of this country? I think he's going to find out, we're going to find out very quickly within the first 3 months whether the Congress and the Republicans will balk at everything and try to obstruct everything, or will they be forced, because of the reality around us, to contribute to governance for the first time in 4 years. I think that would be some small measure of success, definition of success.
And to that point, I mean, it's not just what you get done on a bipartisan basis, it's also the tone. And I wonder where you think he'll be in terms of uniting and speaking to those who didn't vote for him. I mean, it's almost, you know, many presidents at their inaugurations or on election night will say, I'll be your president whether you voted for me or not. But one thing President Trump did say this morning that was true is that 70 million plus people voted for him. That's a record. More people voted for Joe Biden. That's a record, too. We had one of the greatest turnout elections we've ever had. But the point is that there are tens of millions who may feel differently about the scene that they'll watch today. And how will he reach out to them?
You know, Savannah, I really believe that Joe Biden is a person who is grounded in the concept of healing. and he's determined to heal the nation. But healing is the key, and he knows what healing is all about. He's learned it from a life of horrific loss that everyone knows he's endured. But he has endured it, and he has healed himself, and he knows the magic of healing. And I think that's going to be part of the component part of him dealing with Congress, with dealing with a Mitch McConnell. The only way this country is going to get better quickly is if both sides talk to one another at the political level. And I think at the citizenry level, you, me, people around this country, the 74 million who voted for Donald Trump, I hate to say his name, but the 74 million who voted for the former president, combined with the 81+ million who voted for Joe Biden, I think he can address all of them. It's in his nature. He's an understanding guy. He's a genuine human being. He's grounded. He's been grounded for as long as I've known him in the faith that he holds, in the faith in his family, in the faith of the Republic, and in the faith of being able to do his job. So we're going to find out, but I think he's got a PhD in healing, and he's going to bring that to the country.
Mike Barnicle, always good to get your perspective after all these years of knowing the Biden family. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's check in with Kristen Welker right now. She's there on the west front of the Capitol as we see members of Congress gathering, taking their seats. And you'll note the seats are spread out as we've become accustomed to in this age of COVID. Kristen.
Well, Lester, we just watched Senator Ted Cruz arrive, of course, one of the Republican senators that questioned the legitimacy of the election results, which really underscores the task before President-elect Joe Biden as he tries to unify a deeply divided nation. We are talking about all of the ways in which this inauguration is unprecedented. Well, here is one thing that makes it traditional. The fact that Joe Biden will be sworn in on the west front of the U.S. Capitol. And that is so significant. That can't be understated. Why? Because just 2 weeks ago, there was an insurrection against this Capitol, and the very idea of holding these historic events outside was in question. And so we know that Joe Biden was determined to do it. He thought that was important. It was important to show that strength and important to try to set the tone that it is time for the country to move beyond those horrific events of 2 weeks ago. And then, of course, just 1 week ago, last Wednesday, President Trump was impeached. And so it is that incredibly complicated backdrop that Joe Biden will be sworn in against. And his first and most difficult task is going to be to try to unify this nation. His inaugural address will call for unity, will call for themes of healing, as you were just talking about. But then the really hard work begins. And we are told he's going to try to get down to work today, passing 15 executive orders that will aim to address the myriad of crises that he is dealing with, everything from COVID-19 to the economy and racial disparities. So the question is, though, as President-elect Biden tries to work on legislation, it gets more complicated. Will he be able to reach across the aisle? There you have Senator Bernie Sanders, of course, one of Joe Biden's rivals during the Democratic primary, someone now who is staunchly in his corner. Cory Booker as well arriving. And again, it can't be overstated. Just the fact that these lawmakers are here for this inauguration, which will take place on the West Front Capitol, is significant and is one step toward a return to normalcy after that attack on the U.S. Capitol. Savannah and Lester.
All right, Kristen.
Peggy Noonan joins us. She was a principal speechwriter for President Reagan and NBC News political contributor now. And Peggy, as we look at these images, and we do, of course, recall what was going on 2 weeks ago at the United States Capitol. And now we see congressional leaders coming together and being present for the swearing in of a new president. And I just started thinking about how the attack was, yes, an attack on democracy, but also attacked a note of defiance on the part of the Congress that goes beyond party. I noticed that Mitch McConnell keeps talking about the Article 1 branch in the Constitution, sort of reasserting the primacy of the United States Congress. And I feel that
I have been heartened to see those members of Congress who have come forward and who have spoken bluntly. This was a crowd more or less directed or incited to enter the legislative branch. misstep is the word I'm thinking of, but that's not serious enough. Maybe sin is. And I think, that incident, 1/6, what happened during the insurrection is not just going to disappear. It's going to linger for a really long time. And I think more members of Congress, I think, have become very sober-minded about the historical moment we're in. And I hope, after every tragedy, if you will, there is always opportunity. Tragedies aren't just sad, they open up new possibilities. So I would hope the president-elect could see that opening, and a bunch of sober and serious and experienced people might come together and have some interesting conversations.
Yeah, not sure if we're looking at the presidential-elect motorcade here. I believe we are, making its way to the Capitol. And Peggy, as we watch that, how specific do you think Joe Biden will be in his inaugural address in speaking directly to members of Congress who, up until the end, insisted that his presidency would be illegitimate?
I think they were proven to be on the losing side of that argument, yes. So I would love to see, and Joe Biden well knows that, knew it from the beginning, so I would love to see a long-suffering generosity on his part. As for the words that will be said today, this nation manufactures a lot of words. We are inundated with words every day. We operate under a mountain of them. I think actions will be more eloquent and persuasive in the future. I always say, everybody said Ronald Reagan was such an optimistic guy. He let us feel optimism again. And I say, no, he didn't just smile and make you optimistic. He was confident. He felt he and the American people could move forward and make progress. And as people saw that happening, it made them feel optimistic. So it's all in the actions, Lester. And man, I would love to see Joe Biden tomorrow go up to Congress and sit down, have a cup of coffee with a bunch of people and say, we're turning the page together. What can we accomplish?
Well, attending a church service together is probably a good start toward that end, and we saw that just a short time ago. Peggy Noonan, thanks.
And we've heard a lot this morning, people remarking on the healing that needs to take place in the nation, but anybody who's ever had a wound knows that most wounds don't heal overnight. So this is where that work begins, and we will begin to witness it today as this inauguration takes place and the inaugural speech, and we are watching these scenes as the dignitaries arrive at the Capitol.
Kamala Harris there and her husband now exiting the vehicle.
And there's the president-elect also arriving just now onto the steps of the Capitol. And we've got about an hour and a half to go before our Constitution prescribes that the new president will be sworn in.
Yeah, let's go to Craig Melvin, who's on the east front of the Capitol here as we watch the president-elect make his arrival. Craig?
Lester, right now, you see the president-elect there. From our vantage point, we also see the soon-to-be First Lady as well, Dr. Jill Biden. There she is, Dr. Biden, putting on her gloves there. It is quite chilly. In fact, there were some snow flurries here in the nation's capital a short time ago. And Senator Harris, soon-to-be Vice President Harris, and I screwed this up earlier. I want to make sure I get it right this time. The soon-to-be First Gentleman, Doug Emhoff, all of them set to make their way up the steps. We should point out here, as they get ready to proceed up the steps, they are flanked on both sides by members of the Capitol Police. And they are being flanked by members of the Capitol Police because of, obviously, what happened here 2 weeks ago, as we see the soon-to-be President and First Lady. Again, it's a little difficult to make out with the masks on, but I believe they are being greeted by members of the two members of the JCCIC, the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies. We saw Senator Klobuchar as well, who's one of the members of that committee a few minutes ago, sort of inspecting the troops, if you will. But they'll go in. They'll be greeted by members of the leadership as we listen in for just a moment.
It's really stunning to watch the president-elect standing at the foot of those stairs, those very stairs that 2 weeks ago we saw the desecration of our U.S. Capitol.
And perhaps he's pausing there and has that very thing in his mind, or perhaps he's thinking of the day, oh gosh, decades ago when he first came to Congress as a United States Senator, a young man then in grief who had just lost his wife and daughter in a car crash and had 2 young sons. And now we see all these years later, the president-elect, the soon-to-be First Lady, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who will make history in more ways than one today, and the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, as they now enter the building where they walk in as President and Vice President-elect, but will walk out as the new President and Vice President of the United States.
Joe Biden spent a lot of time in that building as a member of Congress and of course, as Vice President as well. Andrea Mitchell, I want to get your thoughts. Again, juxtaposing what you're looking at now as opposed to what we looked at 2 weeks ago today.
Well, that is the stark contrast. I don't ever recall this happening because usually they come in through the Capitol and come out at the top of the steps there right on the podium. But walking up those steps where the Capitol was breached, that's where the first access to the Capitol took place on January 6th. I think that was a symbolic greeting by Senators Klobuchar and Blunt, who are the 2 chairs, the leaders, bipartisan, of the Rules Committee, which is traditionally done. And now they're coming into the Capitol together up the steps, both the Bidens and the Harrises. They did not, of course, have the greeting at the White House that would have normally taken place between the president-elect, his spouse, and, of course, the outgoing president.
Andrea,
so that's why this is so different.
I just was told in my ear by our producer that Eugene Goodman, the Capitol Police officer escorting Vice President-elect Harris, is some will recognize from heroic actions that day as the insurrectionists and rioters broke into the Capitol. He was the officer who, in a moment of great poise, led them in a different direction away from an open door to the Senate chamber. And in that moment, many have said perhaps saved untold lives. And who knows what could have happened but for his heroism. And he, of course, is getting a place of honor today.
Well, Savannah, in fact, they are voting to give him the Congressional Gold Medal for that bravery and for the brilliance, really, of his quick decision-making. Recall that he was drawing them up to the top of the second floor, the steps there. And on that landing at the second floor, he quickly spotted that if they had turned to the left, they would have been 100 feet from where Vice President Pence and his family were then being secluded by the Secret Service, having just been taken off the podium of the Senate chamber just minutes before. Instead, he drew them to the right and saved any interaction or a confrontation between the Vice President and the Secret Service, of course, and the oncoming mob. So it was just incredibly heroic.
All right, Andrea, thank you. Let's go to Hallie Jackson right now. Hallie, again, putting into perspective all this, your thoughts?
I'm struck by a couple of things, Lester. How many times has Joe Biden walked into this Capitol building over the course of his career, over the course of his many decades in public service? Thousands upon thousands of times, but never like this. And same goes for Vice President-elect Harris, for that matter as well, who served in this chamber. This is a moment for them, and it is a moment for the country to see as they walked up those stairs where 2 weeks ago we all were live on the air here broadcasting the rioters breaching the steps. You notice who's not here, President Trump, as we have talked about, who, of course, remains president until noon today. But look at who is here. We know that Vice President Mike Pence has arrived. We've seen a number of the president's allies here, Republicans, more than 50 of them by our team's count, who voted to object to the Electoral College count certifying President-elect Biden's win, are expected to be in attendance today. One of my producers spotted Congressman Jim Jordan, for example, one of President Trump's closest allies, who is attending today, somebody who's been speculated to potentially be involved in his impeachment trial. That means something, these individuals' attendance here. And while Joe Biden does come into office with many around the country, and frankly here in Washington, hoping for him to be able to make good on that promise of unification, he has some challenges ahead of him. Polling shows that most Americans, many Americans, are concerned about the uphill battle as it relates to unity, as it relates to progress. And the president-elect, we often talk about the first 100 days. He does not have that kind of luxury of time. This country is facing the crisis of public health and the pandemic, the economic crisis. He has two major bills, a $1.9 trillion economic relief bill and a massive immigration bill that will be sent to Congress today by the end of this week. And he is going to need cooperation from the spectrum of people that you see here on stage, from, Senator Bernie Sanders, who we saw a shot of a few moments ago on the left, to Senator Ted Cruz, House Republicans on the right, to be able to get some of what he wants to do through Congress. He's going to do a lot in the next 3 days as far as executive orders, a federal mask mandate, for example. He's going to reverse a series of executive actions that President Trump took in his early days in office and throughout his 4 years. But executive orders can only get you so far. And I believe we're taking a look as we talk about the president's allies at Senator Lindsey Graham here, somebody else who has been with the president even in his final days of office, flying with him on Air Force One, for example, on the president's last trips here. Joe Biden is going to need that help to create the kind of change that he wants to create, to get done what he wants to get done, because those actions that he can take just via the power of the presidency only get him so far. As we look at what appears to be Steve Scalise, one of course, the Republican leaders walking through the halls of Congress here. I am also struck, as we take a moment to reflect here, this area that we've seen, and you saw a shot of what's called the crypt, where those big pillars are, packed with those insurrectionists just 2 weeks ago, chanting words like "hang Mike Pence," chanting about wanting to find lawmakers in their offices and bring them, in their words, to justice. It is such a different scene today, and I think it's powerful, and one of the reasons why you saw the Biden team push so hard to make sure that despite all the security measures in place in Washington, and this is my third inauguration, and I'll tell you, it looks very different than all the rest, at least from our perspective, he is able to stand on the West Front and do this. Typically, it's one of the things we get to do is spot people, talk about who we see. It's a lot harder to do when everyone's wearing masks, but that's another big change here. As I look out from the risers of the West Front, social distancing is in place for all of these chairs. Masks are virtually on every single person that I've seen so far. They are all but a requirement here. And that is a significant change to what we've seen. As you both know, typically you're packed like sardines here. It is another sign, as we saw last night with the president-elect's service there at the Lincoln Memorial, another sign that the backdrop to all this is not just the political disunity, the discord, the concern about where this country goes from that perspective. It's the pandemic, and that is the number one priority for President-elect Biden moving forward.
Hallie Jackson,
Savannah.
thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are joined by someone who has a unique perspective on these events, former Vice President Al Gore, who, of course, served in the Clinton administration, was the 2000 Democratic nominee for president. And we all know the rest of the story after there. Mr. Vice President, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me, Savannah. It's a happy day.
What are your thoughts as you see this ritual of democracy, not like any way we've seen it before because of the pandemic, because of what happened at the Capitol, but yet it goes on? What does it mean to you?
It means our republic lives, the center has held, democracy will return in full spirit. It means to me that when Joe Biden walks into the Oval Office not long from now, science will walk in with him. A reverence for truth will walk in with him. A commitment to seeking bipartisan solutions to our country's problems will walk in with him. Empathy will walk in with him. And I'm overcome with the hopefulness that this ceremony brings to us.
What is the significance of the absence of the outgoing president as part of this? Did Donald Trump, in some ways, do Joe Biden a favor by not being here?
Well, I had to chuckle just a little bit, Lester, when Joe Biden was asked about Trump's decision, and he said it was one of the few things he agreed with him on. You could argue it both ways. In some ways, it would be good for him to be there and uphold the traditions of our country. But under all the circumstances, it's just fine that he's not there.
Mr. Vice President, forgive me for getting personal. I know this is not your favorite subject, but we would be remiss if we didn't ask you what it was like. Because 20 years ago, where were you on this day? You were right there, having lost a hard, bitterly fought election, the recount, 534 votes, and you came. And in fact, I believe you presided over the January 6th certification of the electoral votes as the president of the Senate, since you were vice president then. What was that like for you in those moments? What was going through your mind?
Well, thank you for asking, Savannah. And the answer is actually pretty simple, because the importance of the United States of America in all of human history. In Lincoln's phrase, we still are the last best hope of humankind. And the choice between one's own disappointment in your personal career and upholding the noble traditions of America's democracy is a pretty easy choice when it comes down to it.
Mr. Vice President, we're not just facing a division in terms of political terms and policy terms. We're facing division from people who don't think this is going to be a legitimate presidency, who think that the country is somehow under an assault against freedom. That's a bigger hill to climb than any president has faced in trying to unify a country. How do you think, Joe Biden will go about it?
Well, I think, as others have said, Lester, he is the man for this moment. He is constituted in a way that leads him to reach out to others and build a bipartisan consensus wherever he can. This is hardly the first time, or the second or third or fourth or fifth time, when the side that lost an election feels bitterness and disappointment, but decides after reflection to put the nation first. And I hope very much that those who are still holding on to the lost cause of the outgoing president's reelection, which wasn't to be, will pause and reflect on what's far more important. And what's more important is the United States of America. And I do believe that with the passage of time, we are likely to see the kind of leadership Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are already beginning to provide will bring more toward the recognition that our people have chosen. And all just power is derived from the consent of the governed. The American people made this choice, and their choice is entitled to respect. I believe it will be given that respect in due time by the vast majority of Americans.
And a key question as you talk about how to go forward and whether the two sides can come together and find common ground, we can't ignore the fact that there's been an impeachment in the House, and the Senate will have to take up that matter and conduct a trial. And I wonder where you come down on it. Do you believe President Trump should be impeached by the Senate, and convicted?
Well, I listened with interest when Mitch McConnell spoke yesterday and indicated, in effect, that Donald Trump was responsible for the mob's assault on the Capitol. He said the mob was fed lies and provoked by the president. The mob was not the only group fed lies. One of the reasons why many of Donald Trump's supporters in the campaign still doubt the outcome of the freest and fairest election in our history is that they were fed lies as well. My faith tradition teaches me, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. The truth will eventually carry the day. Now, in the trial in the Senate, the evidence will decide the outcome. I don't mind telling you, if I were still in the Senate, I would vote to convict because I think accountability for this grave crime against the American Republic must be followed by accountability for those who instigated organized, provoked, and started it. And so we will see if enough Republican senators take the same approach that Mitch McConnell has signaled, to listen to the evidence and make a considered judgment. I think that, well, we'll see what the outcome is, but I would not bet against conviction.
Former Vice President Al Gore, who on this day 20 years ago was right there in the midst, in the thick of the action. Thank you, sir, for your perspective. It's a unique one, and we're very grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break right now, but we'll be back with much more of our Inauguration Day coverage as we await the swearing in of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. We'll be right back.
Are you ready?
Monday boost?
Are you ready for a boost?
How do you feel about that book?
We love those nurses. That was beautiful.
We are a country of laws, a democracy built on free and fair elections, where the majority, not the mob, rules, and no rioter, no act of insurrection or domestic terror, no desperate despot can take away all we have built, all that we stand for, and all we hold dear.
Make no mistake, what happened that day was an insurrection against the United States government. Is this the beginning of something or the end of something? Should Donald Trump be ostracized from the Republican Party as you know it? If it's Sunday.
Looking at the west front of the Capitol, where in about an hour and 15 minutes, Joe Biden will take the oath of office along with Kamala Harris as vice president. The field of flags in the foreground. We would normally expect to see people there, but owing to COVID and then, of course, the restrictions regarding security, there will be no spectators other than the invited ones. And this looks like the Clintons arriving.
Yeah, we're watching that hallway where we've seen the dignitaries. The Clintons, just one of several former first couples who will be there today, including the Bushes and the Obamas. President Carter, who's well into his 90s now, will miss inauguration for the first time. And of course, as mentioned, President Trump has decided not to attend. And in fact, Air Force One carrying President Trump has just arrived in Florida, I'm told, or is arriving. There we go, a shot of Air Force One. Yes, on approach for its final landing carrying President Trump. And he has, as you mentioned, about an hour and a half or so, hour and 20 minutes remaining in his term as the 45th president of the United States. Let's go to Casey Hunt. She's on Capitol Hill for us. And Casey, we've talked a lot about security. We see these dignitaries and everyone looks pretty calm, cool, and collected, but there have to be some jitters given what happened on these very steps 2 weeks ago.
There absolutely are, Savannah, and there are people who have decided not to attend the inauguration today because they're worried about security. Obviously, I'm standing on a lawn here down front of the Capitol that normally would be packed with people, and instead there's plenty of grass between me and the dignitaries that you can see seated behind me, just a few invited here. But even some of those who were extended an invitation decided they didn't want to risk it. And I know at least one Democratic member of Congress came to attend this ceremony wearing body armor, wearing a bulletproof vest. And it's possible there are others. We're working on reports that say as much as that. I also spoke to one member who decided that they didn't want their spouse to come because they were worried about who was going to be with their children in the event something terrible happened. And that anxiety has really been pervading Capitol Hill. I mean, the doors on the east front that were broken open by rioters, one of them is still broken. It hasn't been fixed yet. So this building still bears the physical scars of what happened on January 6th. And those are, of course, scars that our country is dealing with collectively and metaphorically as well. And of course, trying to heal those scars is a major theme for the incoming president-elect Joe Biden today. And I will also say, Savannah, I was thinking about this as you were showing the Air Force One landing in Florida. There was a pretty strong strong message sent here from Republicans. The vice president, current vice president Mike Pence, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, Lindsey Graham, a senator from South Carolina, once one of President Trump's staunchest allies. They are all here. They did not attend that farewell ceremony that the president threw for himself at Andrews Air Force Base as he was leaving Washington here. Instead, they came here. Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, told Pool reporters on his way in that he was here to send a signal that our institutions stand and that the inauguration represents all of that and those continuing traditions that, frankly, President Trump abandoned in large part over the last 4 years. And as I've been watching everything unfold today, especially that visit to church where Joe Biden, the incoming president, reaches out to all four bipartisan elected leaders in Congress and says, please come to church with me, and they say yes. That is radical normalcy, it feels like to me. It is just not something that has been a traditional part of covering Washington under the Trump administration, but it was previously that way for many, many years before, to the point that it would have been unremarkable. And that is, of course, kind of the overarching theme. And I believe we're also hearing George W. Bush and his wife Laura Bush about to come in right now. Again, another signal from a past Republican president that, okay, we are here, we are sending a message to the world, to the people of America. We are going to stand together even after everything we've been through.
And Casey, as you note, there is the President Bush and Laura Bush just introduced and making their way to their seats. And we saw just behind them the Obamas as the former living presidents, except for Jimmy Carter, attending this inauguration.
That's right, Lester. And I think we can't overstate the degree to which, and you were just talking about this as well with the former Vice President Al Gore, about what's going to happen next in this impeachment trial that we know is going to unfold in the Senate. And, you know, Democrats for sure don't want that to be the focus of the day today by any stretch. And I know Jen Psaki spoke with Savannah about this on the Today Show. They didn't want to weigh in on impeachment one way or the other. And I know Democrats I talked to certainly want to keep the focus on the day. But I will say those words from Mitch McConnell yesterday, that the president bears responsibility for what happened here, for the scars this building bears, for the scars we all have as a nation, really struck me in terms of his possible willingness to say, okay, we may go ahead and convict outgoing President Trump. I keep checking my watch to make sure I'm using the right adjectives. It's not yet noon, so Donald Trump's still president of the United States. But obviously, they are making a show of making sure that they demonstrate that it is in fact true that Joe Biden won the election. He is going to be the president of the United States. It is not, as Donald Trump has told the American public, he did not win this election. And that repeated lie from President Trump convinced all of these people to come here.
But what stands before us? We close the divide because we know to put our future first. We must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew. That even as we hurt, we hoped. That even as we tired, we tried. That we'll forever be tied together, victorious. Not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it in its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So, while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens, but one thing is certain: if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the wind-swept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
Her name is Amanda Gorman. She is 22 years old, from Los Angeles. And what a just powerful, beautiful piece of poetry she just delivered.
Well, you'd hate to follow her.
Yeah.
She did. We had prose, and now we've had poetry, and we've had song.
Now for our benediction, I'm pleased to introduce Reverend Dr. Sylvester Beeman, the pastor of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Wilmington, Delaware, a friend of President Biden for 30 years.
As a nation and people of faith gathered in this historical moment, let us unite in prayer. God, we gather under the beauty of your holiness and the holiness of your beauty. We seek your face, your smile, your warm embrace. We petition you once more in this celebration. We pray for divine favor upon our President, Joseph R. Biden, and our First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, and their family. We further ask that you would extend the same favor upon our Vice President, Kamala D. Harris, and our Second Gentleman, Doug Emhoff, and their family. More than ever, they and our nation need you. We need you, for in you we discover our common humanity. In our common humanity, we will seek out the wounded and bind their wounds. We will seek healing for those who are sick and diseased. We will mourn our dead. We will befriend the lonely, the least, and the left out. We will share our abundance with those who are hungry. We will do justly to the oppressed, acknowledge sin, and seek forgiveness, thus grasping reconciliation. In discovering our humanity, we will seek the good in and for all our neighbors. We will love the unlovable, remove the stigma of the so-called untouchables. We will care for our most vulnerable, our children, the elderly, emotionally challenged, and the poor. We will seek rehabilitation beyond correction. We will extend opportunity to those locked out of opportunity. We will make friends of our enemies. We will make friends of our enemies. People, your people, shall no longer raise up weapons against one another. We will rather use our resources for the national good and become a beacon of life and goodwill to the world. And neither shall we learn hatred anymore. We will lie down in peace and not make our neighbors afraid. In you, O God, we discover our humanity. In our humanity, we discover our commonness. Beyond the difference of color, creed, origin, political party, ideology, geography, and personal preferences, we'll become greater stewards of your environment, preserving the land, reaping from it a sustainable harvest, and securing its wonder and miracle-giving power for generations to come. This is our benediction, that from these hallowed grounds, where slaves labored to build this shrine and citadel to liberty and democracy, let us all acknowledge, from the indigenous Native American to those who recently received their citizenship, from the African American to those whose foreparents came from Europe and every corner of the globe, from the wealthy to those struggling to make it, from every human being, regardless of their choices, that this is our country. As such, teach us, O God. As such, teach us, O God, to live in it, love in it, be healed in it, and reconcile to one another in it, lest we miss kingdom's goal. To your glory, majesty, dominion, and power forever. Hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. In the strong name of our collective faith, amen.
Please remain standing as the Armed Forces Color Guard retires our national colors.
And that concludes the inauguration ceremony at the Capitol. It looked different than any other, and as we expected, the empty spaces, the social distancing. What we didn't see, except in a few cutaways, I suppose, the soldiers, that ring of steel around this general area, owing to what happened 2 weeks ago. I want to bring in NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, give me your first early reaction to the inauguration speech.
Please be seated.
Terrific speech, and I think, Lester, it'll be known for 3 words. Democracy has prevailed. The new president is talking about the last 4 years as a period where there were attacks on democracy, attacks on truth, attacks on humanity, looking at it sort of a 4-year aberration from the general course of American history. I thought the speech was modest, austere. Needs to be united and also needs to mourn more than 400,000 Americans who have died of a terrible virus, more than died in the military in World War II.
And Michael, there's no question that the the president is looking to turn the page, saying we must end this uncivil war. And on the steps of the Capitol and with allusions to Abraham Lincoln, that is not a throwaway line, especially when you think about what happened 2 weeks ago when there was an insurrection attempted at the United States Capitol to subvert democracy itself. As you mentioned, he said this is America's day, this is democracy's day, and democracy has prevailed. He clearly feels that, above all, unity is the business and the mission of this presidency.
You were so right, Savannah. And he's saying something, you know, at all these inaugurations, every new president lauds democracy and the peaceful transfer of power so much that we take it for granted. President Biden, 2 weeks after the attack on the Capitol and the Congress of January 6th, is speaking to us at a moment in which we have just had a very close call. Under a few scenarios, we might have lost our democracy. What might we be talking today? And at the same time, he recognizes that he has to deal with more crises at once than almost any president in American history. The pandemic, the economic crisis, people are starving and out of jobs, a crisis of racial justice that's gone on for 400 years with systemic racism, a crisis of climate change, and others. These are not things that he could just afford to say, maybe I'll do that after the midterm election, or maybe I'll do it if I'm reelected to a second term. He knows he has to do all these things right now. Very tough for a new president.
The new president and new first lady making their way now up from the platform. We'll see them again a bit later at the laying of the wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. Let me bring in Mike Barnacle into our conversation, a veteran journalist, an NBC News contributor, also a longtime family friend of the Bidens. Michael, he spoke of unity as we thought. He acknowledged that some may see it as words. What are the deeds that will have to follow to fully deliver this message?
Well, I think the deeds are obvious to all, Lester. He's got to attack the virus with a vaccine, apply it to hundreds of millions of Americans in order to get the rest of the ball rolling and get the job done. The speech itself, I thought, though, had elements, deeply personal elements. At one point, the president said, there's no accounting for what fate will do to you. And God knows that's true for Joe Biden. He has carried his own cross for 50 years of loss and suffering, but also of resilience. And his very presence on the stage today was a form of resilience in full flower. We saw him as President of the United States, and he spoke to elements of his own character, his own personality, that he thinks should apply to the United States of America. Elements of humility, tolerance, generosity, and optimism. And as Savannah just mentioned, he said, you know, we've got to end this uncivil war. That's in his nature to do that. The speech, while personal, it was also political, and it was about joining together as a country and reestablishing the component part of truth in government, truth in the Oval Office, something that's been sorely missing for 4 years.
I thought it was interesting, Mike, as well. It was very much a Joe Biden speech, and he spoke and addressed those who aren't his supporters and said, as many presidents have said, I'll work as hard for you as I do for those who did support me. But then he said something else. He said, if you didn't support me, all I ask is hear me out. Hear me out. Take a measure of me and my heart. And if you still disagree, well, that's democracy.
Yeah, you know, Savannah, that's really interesting because he did say that, and you can hear him say that across the table to a Mitch McConnell. And Mitch McConnell has listened to Joe Biden in the past and would certainly, we all hope as Americans, would listen to him now because he knows that Joe Biden means what he says, that I know you might not agree with me on the total package, the cost of it or whatever, but hear me out. And Mitch McConnell knows something else, that in looking across the table at Joseph R. Biden, the 46th President of the United States, he is looking at an honest man, a good man, someone not out to get the better of him just for the sport of getting the better of someone else, an opponent, someone intent on doing what he can to do for the greater good of all of us as Americans.
Mike, you know the man. He's 78 years old, but I like to think that we all continue to grow. How has he grown from when he threw his hat in the ring as a candidate, when we had never heard of a thing called COVID, where people weren't trying to, tear down the Capitol? How has he changed? How has he grown into this job that he just took on?
I think over the years, especially over the last few years, he has become calmer, more accepting of fate. He is not bitter about any of the elements of fate that have cost him and his family so much. And I think that has helped him as a public person. I can remember the morning of the New Hampshire primary, backstage off the set of Morning Joe and talking to him, and he knew what the result was going to be. And he knew that he was going to get crushed in New Hampshire, having already been crushed in Iowa. But again, I get back to resilience, that word. That's in his character. He's a resilient person. And he wasn't meeting the results of both states, either Iowa or New Hampshire, with any bitterness. His innate sense of optimism still flourished, still grew, and he couldn't wait to get to South Carolina. And he got to South Carolina with a calmness and a commitment and a sense of purpose, all things that have driven him for all of his life. And look where we are today.
It's interesting, Mike, because you talking about New Hampshire reminds me of, I interviewed him in Iowa, where he was coming in third or fourth, and I talked to him backstage at a rally that barely anybody was there, and no one thought he would be the nominee, let alone the president. And actually, off camera, he said to me, just watch, I'm going to win this thing. I'm going to win this thing, meaning the presidency. Yeah. So there was something, a resoluteness that, frankly, back then, it sounded like happy talk, but he certainly seemed to believe it, truly believe it in his soul, that this is exactly where he would end up.
Yeah, that's who he is. In large part, that's who he is. In New Hampshire, again, backstage, I put my hands on his shoulders and I said, you're going to be okay. And in his right hand, from his pants pocket, he removed some rosary beads and showed them to me. He carries rosary beads with him every single day of his life. He looked at the rosary beads, he looked at me and said, I'm going to be all right. That's who he is.
Mike Barnicle, I want to bring in Andrea Mitchell right now, who's been standing by. Andrea, give me your early impressions of the inauguration ceremony, the speech, and where we go now.
Well, the ceremony, the speech, I thought were really important and optimistic, hopeful, but confronting. Right at the beginning, the new president spoke of the insurrection, spoke of the riot. He talked about democracy was tested. Democracy, America has been tested, and we have prevailed. Democracy and justice have prevailed. So he confronted that reality. He was not hiding from it, but goes on to speak very plainly, but also eloquently. There was great poetry, really, in his prose, in that he was speaking directly to Americans in the way that was authentic for Joe Biden, but also had the cadence and the lilt and the lift of an important moment, because he was calling us to be together and to be resilient. All of that was very powerful to me. He confronted the difference between lies and truth, not just saying, I'm never going to lie to you, but really saying that lies and the purpose of achieving power or what has been so terrible. That was the implication, and we all know what he was talking about. Also, the pageantry and the songs, and I've got to say, Amanda Gorman, the young poet laureate, she became the poet laureate of Los Angeles at the age of 16. She's now 22. She had said that she was finishing her poem after the riot, after the insurrection, and was not going to gloss over it, and she did not. But she said, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. There will always be light. I just thought her whole manner, and I just also to take us back to the sober reality, because the new president spoke looking around him, very comfortable in that moment, which really gave a sense of a new confidence. He really has grown, as you were just discussing with Mike Barnicle, over these many months. And you first were talking to him back in Iowa with all of those losses in Iowa, New Hampshire, and finally Super Tuesday, but really growing into this moment, looking around him very confidently at the members of Congress, the senators with whom he had served, served for 30 years, and saying, we know that there are people around the world, look at us, and we have survived this, and we will not only go forward, but we're going to go forward and do more, was all that he said. And at this moment, China has done an extraordinary thing, Lester and Savannah. China has sanctioned outgoing Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who left the State Department very somberly this morning, has sanctioned him, his relatives, and any company that he works for, and 28 officials, Peter Navarro, the very aggressive hardliner, the trade negotiator, and other officials, John Bolton, who can never step foot in China, in Hong Kong, or Macau, all part of the Beijing government. And that is an extraordinary sanction.
It's a long list.
Former top U.S. diplomat.
Too. Alex Azar, of course, the former Health and Human Services Secretary, is on the list, as is Matt Pottinger, a deputy in the National Security Council, Robert O'Brien, who was National Security Advisor. So, yes, some news coming out of China at the very moment those officials became former officials. Andrea, stay with us as we continue to watch some of the scenes that were earlier visible at the Capitol. The Obamas exiting the stage, and the former presidents, Bush, Obama, and Clinton, will join the new president at Arlington National Ceremony a little bit later this afternoon for a wreath laying, which we will, wish we could heard what that was over my talking, but in any event, we'll rewind the tape for you. But they'll do that later this afternoon. And we turn now to a couple of guests who certainly know the challenges that any new administration will face. Andy Card, who was Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, John Podesta, Chief of Staff to President Clinton, and Counselor to President Obama. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Raise your hand if you'd like to be Chief of Staff under these circumstances. This is not an easy task before them. I'll let you go, John. What did you think of the speech, and what do you think of what this president has before him?
Well, look, I think as for the speech, I thought it was a powerful call to the idea of America as one nation under God, and a fierce rejection of the politics of division and hate that we've seen for the past 4 years. It was passionate. The line that stuck with me was, "My whole soul is in it," quoting Abraham Lincoln, and Biden saying, "My whole soul is in it, uniting the people." I think everyone watching it knew in his bones that that's what he meant, that's what he expected to convey. He talked about the 4 crises facing the country, and for Ron Klain, the incoming Chief of Staff, for his whole team, they know they have to get on top of COVID, they have to deal with the economic crisis, the racial justice crisis, the climate crisis. It's a huge task, but they've been planning for it, they've stayed disciplined, they haven't been thrown off course, I think, particularly in the last couple of weeks. And so I think they're ready to get into those offices and begin to do the work of the country.
Andy, you were literally in the ear of President Bush at the time of 9/11. You know a little something about an administration suddenly on emergency war footing. This is a little different in that President Biden knew what the country was facing. He's had time to now look at the vaccination plan. Nonetheless, how does it change an administration to have almost a singular focus, so that everything ultimately revolves around COVID?
Well, first of all, I do think that this is a time of history and hope, and this inauguration was a tribute to our democracy. I agree with what the president said, and I loved how he said it. And yes, he acknowledged that there is much to repair, much to restore, and much to rebuild, and that's the challenge.
And Andy, as I just want to pause because I want people to see what's happening here. It's important. The Vice President Harris and her husband Doug Emhoff had just escorted former Vice President Pence and Karen Pence down the East Front steps of the Capitol. And Andy, I mean, to continue your thought, this is a moment that the country needed to see its leaders of both political parties come together. The president, former President Trump, did not choose to attend, but Vice President Pence's choice to come was a real statement. How important do you think that was?
I think it's critically important, and I compliment Vice President Pence for being there, and I actually celebrate the role that he played in the last 10 days to help us celebrate our democracy and restore it and put it on the right path. So I'm glad that he was there, and I'm grateful that Kamala Harris, the new vice president, seems to be very gracious to Vice President Pence, and I think that was a good signal to see. I was also thrilled that the former presidents that were there celebrating our democracy. You know, it's so important for us to polish our democracy. It's been very tarnished, and the world is watching us. So this inauguration was a very good inauguration. I pray that people paid attention to it objectively, put their partisan differences aside, and just listen to it, because this was an inauguration of hope, and I'm going to say resolve and determination to make sure that everyone's voices in this country are heard, but that our democracy for the benefit of everyone. And so I compliment the president for setting a tone that was very important for us to have. We needed it, and it was long overdue.
Former Vice President Mike Pence and his wife, their motorcade now having left the Capitol. Let's go to Craig Melvin, who's there on that
into the rotunda now as we watch former Vice President Mike Pence's motorcade head out. At this point, we don't know where he and Karen Pence are going, but they're leaving the Capitol. So right now, they'll go back inside to the rotunda. The Vice President, President Biden, inside now with the First Lady. They'll have a brief luncheon with House and Senate leadership. And then there'll be a sort of an exchanging of gifts, if you will. Members of the inaugural committee will present some gifts to the President and the Vice President as we watch Speaker Pelosi talking to the new Vice President there as well. And so they'll disappear for roughly 30 minutes. And then after that, they'll descend the steps once again. President Biden and the new First Lady will also join them. And that's when they'll make that procession to Arlington National Cemetery for a wreath-laying ceremony. We're told that the former presidents will go ahead of President Biden, but that they'll all join in the wreath-laying there. That should take about 10 or 20 minutes. They're about 15 minutes behind schedule at this point, Lester and Savannah, but you can see the House and Senate leadership. This is some video from earlier, obviously, but we just saw the House and Senate leadership getting ready to head in for that private luncheon. One thing I can also tell you, just a little bit of color from the east side of the Capitol. Of course, the actual swearing in was on the west side. While that was happening, we got to sort of watch Secret Service transform the beast, as it's known. That, of course, the limousine that President Biden will be traveling in over the next 4 years. They outfitted it with new decals. They attached new U.S. flags to it as well. So the peaceful transfer of power continues. Small and large.
Yeah.
Check the oil and the windshield wiper fluid. And
we saw him wiping it down as well.
Well, it is the COVID era after all. Craig, thank you so much.
I would like to think that the images we've seen here the last couple hours will begin to erase some of what we saw 2 weeks ago, because, you know, that has been so associated now with the Capitol.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it, that hopefully these powerful images of party leaders coming together, of a peaceful transfer, will in some ways supersede those disturbing images that we've seen. We see there Hillary and Bill Clinton walking down the hall, people grabbing their pictures. As mentioned, they're headed to Arlington National Ceremony with the other former presidents in attendance today for a wreath laying. We want to bring in Chuck Todd, and Chuck, you know, these moments, I know you, and I know that you are somebody who grew up watching inaugurations, and you've been a political junkie for your whole life. And, you know, I was thinking about that myself in these last few weeks, and how meaningful it is, and what it gives to the American people to see political rivals and people from different parties come together in a moment of unity and grace, and that itself has a lot of healing potential.
You know, Savannah, to watch Joe Biden today, it was such a stark reminder of how, as a country, we do seek out whatever we think we were missing, you know, whatever it is we thought we were missing in the previous president. He is the better angel president. Joe Biden believes he's eternally optimistic. He's not cynical. The guy's been in Washington so long, you would think, some of us are here too long and you become cynical. He's never cynical. He still thinks the better angels exist, and it was just such an important moment. But you're right. I mean, January 6th has made this, I think, much more meaningful to so many people. Forget just those of us, raised to be history junkies the way I was raised. I mean, it certainly is an elixir. By the way, a point of research, I had my team look. This is the first inaugural address ever to mention the virus of white supremacy. We looked at every inaugural address, and these are important. This inaugural address is part of the American story, and that's what I sort of loved about it, is that Joe Biden wrapped himself in the story of America that sort of has a true north. And it was sort of an attempt to, look, you can't erase the chapter of the last 4 years, but you can put a marker down and show that we've moved forward. And I just think it is important to say the fact that he said white supremacy, and he talked about it as a scourge in this country, and to be the first president to do it, I also think that's just an important marker that years from now will be looked back on as an important inflection point that an American president said.
Yeah, Chuck, you talk about it being an elixir to see people from different parties, coming together. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is an inauguration. This is, a public event. It doesn't erase the fact that some of the people on that very podium did not want to approve the electoral vote count. That it's going to be more than smiles and handshakes and public moments like that to erase what's wrong, what's broken.
I think this is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And, it will be interesting. Joe Biden is a forgiver. And it's going to frustrate some Democrats at times, because I think he is going to want to figure out a way to put his arm around some of these folks in a way, even frankly, when they don't deserve it. Even when they haven't done enough to at a minimum apologize for what they did. The fact that we haven't seen that from these 140-odd Republicans that essentially went on the record to challenge the democracy, I do think it's going to be an enormous challenge. There's levels of distrust inside that Congress that we've never experienced in our lifetimes. When I say distrust, to the point of they fear for their own security around each other. That is such a horrendous and toxic place to be. And it's like it has to, that fever has to break. But I have to tell you, I think it begins, this idea that Joe Biden is always going to be expected to go 90% of the way, which maybe he will, but he shouldn't, when we haven't seen some of these folks go 40% of the way.
And by the way, there's an impeachment trial, perhaps days away, on top of all that.
And look, and it may create more of a divide, but it's going to be a divide inside one party. And I do think it's interesting today. I think we're seeing a picture of there's two Republican parties right now, and the question's going to be, are they going to survive as one and figure out how to become one again? Or are you going to see Trump splinter off into one direction and the pro-democracy Republicans splinter off in another direction? The impeachment trial is going to tell us a lot about that.
Well, there is so much before this new president. We've talked about the challenges. He said, the pandemic, the economy, the issues of racial justice, but add the spirit of this country and the division, put that at the top of the list, because to get anything done on the other, you need to do some repair there. There's much to repair, for sure. We're going to take a quick break. Back with much more of our Inauguration Day coverage right after this.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.